Well, thank you very much indeed, Matthew. A kind introduction. Matthew did work with me in number 10 Downing Street, and he's pretty much unique in working for two poles. Quite a lot of people work for a Powell and a pole, but no one worked with two poles, because I worked for my brother Chris at IPPR before he came to number 10. There's a wonderful article in the paper last week with Matthew giving his advice to Gordon Brown on what to do in government, but they unfortunately used the wrong photograph of Matthew Taylor, the former Lib Dem MP. Which now I think a goat, isn't he? One of the advisors to government of all the talents. And reminded me that I used to always have the same problem. When I went to number 10, they didn't have any photographs of me, so they'd always publish a photograph of Jonathan Powell, who'd been a TV producer and then head of the BBC Two, and much older and much uglier than me. I used to resent it enormously, until Angie Hunter, who actually used to really run number 10, compelled me to go and have my photograph taken by PA. And it was stuck up, and I've lived to regret it ever since, with a scarcely grinning face. I'd rather revert to having the Matthew Taylor type approach to photographs, if I could. The 10th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement has been the cause of a certain amount of self-congratulation, some of it deserved. But it's interestingly smoked out a right-wing critique of the Northern Ireland peace process, what you might call the Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail tendency. And there have been articles, quite long articles, over the last 2-3 weeks by Melanie Phillips, by Charles Moore, Peter Hitchens, Max Hastings, and Dean Godson. And to only lightly caricature their argument, it is that the Blair government sacrificed the moderate centre in Northern Ireland. We gave in to the demands of the terrorists instead of defeating them militarily. We left the extremes in power in Northern Ireland when we'd finished. That they go on to say we might have been better off staying with the moral clarity of the Troubles rather than what we have now. And above all, that it's not a model for the peace processes elsewhere. Now, I lightly caricature, but not much. If you, particularly Peter Hitchens, I think you'd find that's a pretty moderate version of what he said. But I think this is an interesting analysis. It's wrong historically, wrong in three counts. Firstly, it's wrong because the Blair government, like its predecessors, tried very hard to build from the centre in Northern Ireland. We worked very closely with the UUP, led by David Trimble, the moderate unionist party. We worked very closely with the SDLP, the moderate nationalist party. But we were stymied in trying to build from the centre like that because the SDLP weren't able to move without the Sinn Féin going with them. They'd really sold the pass on this in the late 1980s when John Hume very bravely met with Gerry Adams. He eventually got a Nobel Peace Prize for doing it, but at the time he got brickbats and nothing else. But in doing that, he had really sold the pass on the SDLP position, I think. They were almost destined to go the way of the Redmondites after 1916 in Dublin, that when there is another party that's a better champion of nationalism and you won't move without them, you're in a very difficult situation. So when Tony Blair called in 1997 in Parliament for the train to leave the station without Sinn Féin, if Sinn Féin wouldn't get on board, we were really bluffing at the time because we couldn't move forward without the SDLP. We had to have a Catholic party that would join the process, or you couldn't have power sharing going forward. And over the period of, that we were in office, we made a number of efforts to get John Hume and later Seamus Mallon to agree to move ahead without Sinn Féin, but they simply couldn't do so. So I don't really accept the critique that we deserted the SDLP at all. And on the unionist side, I don't accept the critique either that we deserted David Trimble. Tony Blair was burning a candle, if that's the right term for a unionist politician, for David Trimble very late in the process. He was still rooting for him long after the Irish government, the Northern Ireland office, David Trimble's own party, and the Northern Ireland population had given up on him. Even after the 2003 election, Tony Blair was still trying to find a way that David Trimble could come back into power and could resolve peace, because he just didn't believe that Ian Paisley would be prepared to do so. And when others urged us to get rid of David Trimble, for example, at the time of suspension in the year 2000, Tony Blair absolutely refused to do so and felt personally committed to the case of David Trimble. So I don't accept either that we deserted the UUP. The third claim, that the IRA got what they wanted, I think is equally misplaced. You may remember that what the IRA wanted was a united Ireland, and it didn't get a united Ireland. What it got was the ability to pursue its aims by political means, to argue for a united Ireland, but not to get one by force or the threat of force. What the Unionists got was the Union, the abandonment by the Irish government of the claim to the territory of Northern Ireland. They got a devolved assembly, and they got peace and prosperity as well. Those were the things they were demanding from the initiation of the province of Northern Ireland. So I don't think it's a fair critique either to say we gave in to the terrorists and gave them what they wanted. I think also it's very important that you be prepared to talk to terrorists if you want to bring about a solution in these kinds of situations. You have to, if you want to get the guns out of politics, and if that's what's being demanded of you by the Unionists, then you have to talk to Sinn Féin and persuade them to give up the guns. You can't do it without talking to them. I must say I found it very difficult at the beginning anyway to talk to Sinn Féin representatives. My own family had been, my father had been shot at by the IRA, my brother had been on a death list for 10 years. I felt quite strongly about it. But it is necessary in a process like this to build up trust, to establish a relationship with such people if you're going to negotiate with them and persuade them to give up their guns. There was, even late on, a certain frisson of worry about Republicans for me. I remember we were negotiating in a monastery in West Belfast, the Clonard Monastery, and I was a bit worried about being late for my plane. I started fiddling with my watch because the minute hand had become loose. And Martin McGuinness couldn't help noticing that it had come loose and offered to take it to a small watchmenders at the end of his street. And I said, no, Martin, honestly, we really don't need to do that. That's quite fine. But he absolutely insisted and took it away. And he very kindly brought it back to me at Leeds Castle where we were negotiating. And I, of course, then had to give it to the security authorities, who took it to pieces to look for listening devices and beacons and all the rest of it. And unfortunately loosened the minute hand again, so I had to have it fixed at very great expense. I told Martin that the other day, and he insists it still has a bug in it, so I'm a little worried since I still wear it. But the serious point from this is you cannot think that you will persuade Republicans in this case, but terrorists in other cases, to give up their weapons unless you talk to them. So you have to talk to them unless you think there is a purely military solution. And the British Army, after a disastrous start in Northern Ireland with Bloody Sunday and then the internment, realized quite early in the 1980s that there wasn't going to be a military solution. They could constrain violence, they could contain it, but they couldn't ever defeat the IRA any more than the IRA could ever defeat them. So they certainly didn't believe there was a military solution. So I think these critics are wrong in suggesting that somehow we could have won a military battle against the IRA if we just removed the constraints on the military and given enough time to it. And as for their argument that we'd be better off back in the time of the Troubles, that's a very easy thing to say from London and the relative safety of living here. It's a lot harder to say if you live in Derry or Belfast and you've been through 3 decades and you're bearing the scars of loss to your family. So I don't take that criticism terribly seriously either. So I think they're wrong on all 3 or even 4 counts in their critique of the Northern Ireland peace process, but they do raise 2 quite interesting questions. The first is it inevitable in these circumstances that the extremes end up in power, that you can't make peace without involving the extremes? And secondly, is it really true there are no lessons for other conflicts from a conflict like this and the solutions that we found for Northern Ireland? And if I take the first, I think there is an element of Nixon goes to China in these circumstances, that if you're in a position where you aren't outflanked, it is easier to make peace. It was much harder for David Trimble, with a divided party being attacked by the DUP, to come to a resolution than it was for Ian Paisley, who knew he couldn't be outflanked. You see a similar thing in Spain, actually, where for the PSOE, for Zapatero's party, it's much harder to make peace because they're constantly being attacked by the PP, by the right-wing party, whereas the PP under Aznar talked to ETA, but weren't, of course, attacked by the socialists. So there is a case for saying that it is easier for the extremes in these circumstances to make the final peace. And if you want it to be lasting, it probably helps that those people are bought in and are given a political stake in the eventual outcome. But I don't think it means you have an eventual hegemony of the extreme parties. I don't think that necessarily happens. One of the interesting things that happens when you bring parties like this into government is that they cease to be extreme almost by definition, because they're in government, they've got to make the hard decisions. And you see that the DUP has already been outflanked by another party more extreme than itself. And I think when Ian Paisley leaves politics next month, that will lead to a more general recalibration of unionist politics. David Trimble used to always argue that at some stage, the sectarian nature of politics would recede in Northern Ireland, and you'd end up with traditional conservative and social democratic parties. And I think he was broadly right about that. I have no idea what timescale it happens on, but I think it is something that happens. So the extremes don't win in the long term anyway, even if you need to bind them into an agreement like that. But turning to the lessons for others that these critics suggest should be avoided at all costs, I think they're right to say that the Northern Ireland dispute, the conflict, was sui generis. It wasn't really a nationalist dispute in traditional terms. It was really a battle between two traditions for political influence, for recognition, for their place in the sun. It didn't take place, as most of the conflicts in the world are, in developing countries or in an ex-communist country. It happened in a Western country. And the areas it touched were very small indeed. There were no more than a few 100,000 people affected directly by the violence at any one moment. So I think it was a sui generis conflict, and I don't think there's general lessons that could be drawn from it. No more do I think really there are general lessons that can be drawn from the solutions that the Northern Ireland politicians found. And in particular, I wouldn't wish the D'Hondt system of choosing ministers on any other country in the world, which is based on a theory came up with by a very obscure Belgian mathematician in the 19th century. It involves lots and lots of counting. And I don't think that was necessarily, for example, something you'd want to inflict on others. So the conflict itself was sui generis, and the solution was sui generis. But I think there are important lessons from the way that peace was brought about that can be learned by conflicts elsewhere. The first, and in some ways most important, is that it wasn't inevitable that we would end up with a solution in Northern Ireland. Even as late as March 2007, it was quite possible that the whole process would have fallen over. I had a terrible sinking feeling when I got a call from Ian Paisley about midnight on the morning of Friday, the 24th of March, 2 days before the deadline. And he said he had to come and see the Prime Minister. And when he came to see him the next morning, he said that he couldn't agree to go into government on Monday, as had been established, but that he was going to insist on a 2-month delay. And Tony and I left the office and went outside on a pretense to deal with other matters, and thought desperately we'd lost the whole process all over again. Just about got there, and the thing had slipped away from us. We came up with the idea of getting a meeting between Gerry Adams and Ian Paisley and making sure it was televised, and that was sufficient to get the Republicans on board. But even that wasn't actually in the end sufficient, because they then spent the weekend negotiating the terms of this meeting and what would happen and how it would happen. And the final issue they had to resolve was the table, because Republicans insisted on sitting next to the DUP because they wanted to look like partners, whereas the DUP insisted on sitting opposite each other because they wanted to look like not too close and a bit of distance between them. And I'm glad to say the Northern Ireland civil servants came up with a brilliant solution of a diamond-shaped table, so they could sit both next to each other and opposite each other at the same time. The reason it's important that people understand it wasn't inevitable is because it's all too easy to say the Northern Ireland solution was inevitable, and it's inevitable that they will not find solutions to their own problems. It's all too easy to say, well, we tried before, we failed, there's no point again. It's just as in Northern Ireland for, well, centuries really, but certainly for decades, the British government thought the Northern Ireland was insoluble and didn't make any effort to try and review it. And it's too easy from Cyprus to the Middle East to Sri Lanka for people to say the same thing. And they need to know that it wasn't inevitable that Northern Ireland was solved. It's not inevitable that they will fail, and if they keep trying, there's every chance that they will solve their own conflicts. The second lesson I think I derive from it, which may apply elsewhere, is that peace is a process and not an event. You get a breakthrough agreement in some of these peace negotiations. We had it with the Good Friday Agreement. In the Middle East, you have it with Oslo. In Sri Lanka, there was a ceasefire agreement of 2002, I think, or one, between the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan government. There was the ceasefire agreement between the Spanish government and ETA. So you can have a breakthrough agreement, but what tends to happen is people are so exhausted having got it, they collapse and don't do anything about implementing it. In the case of Oslo, the Israeli government really didn't try and sell Oslo to the Israeli people. And as it was sort of strung out, the Palestinians, who had initially been extremely enthusiastic, began to lose hope in it, and the whole thing unraveled, and it went back to violence. So I think it's important that people realize that the breakthrough event is actually when the work starts, rather than when it finishes. And when the government very kindly allowed me to go back through the files over the 10 years we were in government from 97 to 2007, and sitting in a little cell down below the Cabinet Secretary's office called the John Major Room, where you're allowed to read these files, and they don't provide any heating to encourage you to stay for a very short period of time while reading them. The thing that leapt out of the pages at me was the importance of process. I almost came to believe that process was everything. If you have a process, there is some hope that you might find a solution, you might find a way through. With no process, there is absolutely no such hope, and people can give up and violence can recur. Shimon Peres, who is the real master of soundbites, had a wonderful expression of this for them in the Middle East, where he said, the good news is there's light at the end of the tunnel, the bad news is there's no tunnel. And he was absolutely right, because the problem in the Middle East is that we all know approximately what the solution to the Middle East is. It's not very different from Taba. We know what the outcome will be, mais ou menos, as the Portuguese say, with a few details around it. What we don't have is any process to get there, and nor do we have the trust that would allow us to build such a process. So I came to believe that process was really, really important in getting to an eventual peace. And in my mind, I summed this up as a bicycle theory, which is a rather boring analogy I stole from the European Union, where they always argue you must keep the process moving forward. But I think it does apply to negotiations. If you don't keep the bicycle moving forward, if you allow it to fall over, it becomes very, very difficult indeed to ever pick it up again. The peace process that you have started, once allowed to stop, is very, very hard to resume. And we made a real effort to make sure that that happened. And Tony Blair has been criticised for his messianic zeal in other areas of policy. But I have to tell you that if he hadn't had that messianic zeal in this area of policy, there wouldn't have been peace in Northern Ireland. If he hadn't every day ordered me to make water flow uphill, if he hadn't refused to accept no as an answer the whole way through the process, there would have never been a solution in Northern Ireland. And also, actually, if he hadn't been prepared to absorb political pain, because although the Tories pretended they were maintaining bipartisanship on Northern Ireland, in fact, they did their very best to make life difficult for us, and worse than that, really, make life difficult for the Ulster Unionist Party by constantly outflanking them and leaving in a position that they had to move to a more extreme position, or have the Tories be more extreme than themselves. So I think that this notion of trying to move the bicycle forward, never let it fall over, is absolutely crucial, even if you have to pay a political price in doing so. That said, I don't think process clearly is enough in itself. Process can come discredited, as it did with Oslo, for example, but also as it did in our case. Because between 1998 and 2003, we spent a huge amount of effort in trying to keep the process level. It almost felt like you're on a seesaw and you were running down to one end and giving concessions to people on the unionist side, running down to the other end and giving concessions to people at the Republican end, just to keep it level. And in the end, that just led to the thing being discredited, particularly on the unionist side. People no longer believed we were trying to do anything other than keep talking. And the transition had gone on too long. The level of violence, low-level violence, but kneecappings, exiling, and that sort of thing that was being carried on in Republican communities discredited the whole thing. And again, I think this is a tendency in negotiations that you can have. To get the initial agreement, you have to have a level of ambiguity. The two sides are by definition so far apart that you can't actually get them to join up all the way in your first agreement. So in the Good Friday Agreement, we were trying to bridge that gap with ambiguity. We were putting in words that people could project their views of what the solution should be into, rather than actually defining the answer. Now, that ambiguity is fine for an initial agreement like that, but it can rapidly lead to the agreement becoming discredited. And at that stage, you then have to squeeze the ambiguity out of it to make people actually agree to what they need to agree to. And that led us to the Belfast Harbour Commissioner's speech in 2003, the beginning of 2003, which was crucially important in terms of beating that ambiguity. Tony Blair took a bit of a risk. He made a speech in which he said that the Republicans had to choose, the IRA had to choose finally between the Armalite and the ballot box. They couldn't carry on having both. The fork in the road had finally arrived. And we were very nervous that the reaction from the Republicans would be bad, that they would walk out at that stage, that violence would recur, the vacuum would be filled by violence. In fact, we had rather the opposite. And then, to my surprise, about 10 days later, Jerry Adams called me up and asked me to draft his speech in response, which I actually found myself doing in my very best Republican speak, which is not that that good. But actually seeing the words coming out of his mouth were really quite remarkable. And at the time, I wasn't sure whether to sue him for plagiarism, but actually I was very grateful that he did do it, because it was a sign they were serious about trying to bring this process to a conclusion, not to walk away from it altogether. One of the things that was unique about our position in Northern Ireland was being a strong facilitator. Often in these sort of negotiations, the facilitator is relatively weak, has no cards in the hand. The British government had ceased to really be a party in the Northern Ireland dispute when Peter Brook made a speech in 1991 saying Britain no longer had any selfish economic or strategic interest in Northern Ireland. In other words, we had no particular outcome we wanted an outcome that everyone else could agree to. So from that stage on, we were a facilitator rather than a party, although I'm not sure Republicans or Unionists actually believed that, but that was the truth of our position at the time. But we weren't just any old facilitator, because we still ruled Northern Ireland, we still had economic and security levers in our hands, and we were able to make things happen or deliver things from one side or the other with those levers. And I think without that level of strength as a facilitator, it would have been very difficult to eventually get to peace. There's another sort of side aspect to that, which was our willingness to involve international players, to bring in George Mitchell, before that Ninian Stephen, General John de Chastelin and others. Many countries with these sorts of disputes, and notably India with Kashmir, refuse to bring in international players. They fear that they will lose sovereignty, they'll lose control of the dispute if they allow there to be an international facilitator. Interestingly, neither the John Major's government nor we felt that was a risk or danger at all, and we're perfectly happy to have international involvement. And I must say, I think in other cases abroad that would be an important aspect, because often the government itself won't be seen as an independent facilitator, and you need to have someone with that degree of independence and autonomy. I think there's one place in the world where you could have a strong facilitator, and that's the Middle East peace process. If the US government was prepared to take on that role, it certainly has economic and security levers. It has the ability to talk to both the Palestinians and the Israelis. It has the ability to be even-handed. It could play the role of a strong facilitator. And I vividly remember George W. Bush coming to Hillsborough in 2001, I think it was, for a summit, and saying at the press conference he was going to devote as much time to the Middle East peace process as Tony Blair had to the Northern Ireland peace process. And I think it's important that American presidents realize that's what it would take. If they wanted to bring about a peace in the Middle East, it would take that kind of dedication, that amount of time, that amount of effort, and that amount of prioritization. And I just hope that American presidents decide that that's the thing to do at the beginning of their term rather than at the end of their terms in the future. There is an important caveat to all of this, though, which is none of this will work unless both sides are absolutely clear they can't win militarily. If either side still thinks there's some option of winning militarily, then it is very hard indeed to bring them together into a proper and meaningful negotiation. You can see that sadly in Sri Lanka at the moment, where, as I said, the agreement unraveled. The government forces now think they can win. Bizarrely, the Tamil Tigers also think they can win with a different sort of strategy. And I fear when you get into that sort of situation, you may have to go through the whole cycle of blood, a whole further revolution before you can get back to the opportunity of making peace. It's a tragedy if you lose another whole generation dying in such disputes before you can actually get into a solution. You see the same thing actually happening at the moment in Niger with the Tuareg, where the government are buying Chinese weapons and trying to see if they can win the battle in the desert rather than negotiate. Which takes me to my final point, really, which is something I didn't think in government, didn't realize in government, but reading the papers, writing the book, and thinking about it, I've come to the conclusion that it is really important to talk to your enemy. If the British government hadn't had a secret channel of communicating with the IRA in the 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s, I'm not quite sure how you'd have got to the ceasefire that you got to in 1993-94. If you think about it, for a democratic government to agree to talk to a terrorist movement that's still killing your people, to publicly go and talk to them. One of the messages in the secret channel was sent, it was about to be sent the day before the Warrington bomb. It was delayed, and they decided they would send it despite the Warrington bomb, which killed two young children, two young boys. So it's very hard to see how publicly they could have got into a conversation with the IRA about a ceasefire. On the other hand, there's no way the IRA would have agreed to a ceasefire unless someone had been talking to them and convincing them that something would happen after it. So I think just almost logistically, you have to have a channel like that, even if it's not used for much. And the channel with the IRA in the 70s, 80s, and 90s wasn't used for a lot. There was a ceasefire in 74 that was important. There was the hunger strike in 81. But apart from that, the channel until 93 wasn't really used for any very serious purpose. And I think that sort of channel is absolutely crucial. And it's crucial also to make sure you have no preconditions. You want to avoid setting preconditions before you all talk to people, because then the people you want to talk to will dig in and say they're not going to meet those preconditions, and you're left either having to give in on those preconditions or not be able to talk to them. So I think, having, as I say, thought about it, that this rule about talking to your enemies should apply also in other disputes. It should apply, in my view, to Hamas. It should apply to Taliban. It should apply to Al-Qaeda. You ought to be able to set up a channel of communications. It may be with a group like Al-Qaeda that they don't want to talk to you. It certainly may be they've got nothing to say to you. But we shouldn't be, as Western governments, the ones refusing to talk. I can't see how that can ever be justified. That is not to say that you should give in to the demands of terrorists any more than we were prepared to give in to the demands for United Ireland in response to force in the 70s and 80s and 90s when we were talking to the IRA. Talking to these groups does not mean accepting their outcome. And it may be, as I say, that a group like Al-Qaeda has no coherent political ideology or no coherent political view of what it wants at this stage. But that doesn't mean to say you shouldn't have this channel, so that when they realize that violence is not going to succeed in reaching their objectives, they understand that here is some way that they can address any legitimate political grievances they have. There is a way of talking when they need to have it. So, of course, as the critics, these right-wing critics say, that Al-Qaeda are different. Of course, Al-Qaeda are evil. But I don't remember the IRA being good terrorists in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s any more than Al-Qaeda are now. What they do is evil. It is inexcusable, but we still have to find a way of being able to deal with them. So I feel it's been very worthwhile writing this book if even a couple of lessons applied elsewhere, if even a couple of our mistakes served as useful ways of other people not making quite the same mistakes when they're doing a process like this. And the one thing I think I'd say to them above anything else is that they should try and try again, and if that fails, they give it another go. Thank you very much.